Tonight, your challenge is to separate what is true from what is false. Some real, some fake. Can you judge which are fact and which are fiction? To find out, you must enter a world of both truth and deception. A world that is beyond belief.
The phone rang again last night. That was what the woman had said. Quietly, her hands trembled around her tea. It was my brother. But he's been dead for 2 years. In the early 1990s, in a quiet little neighborhood on the edge of Ipoh, Malaysia, phones started ringing. Not for sales, and not for scams. They rang at strange hours, and when someone picked up, it wasn't silence. It wasn't breathing. It was heavy static. It was someone that they knew. Someone who should have been buried a long time ago. The name was almost ironic. Taman Newtown, a fresh development built on quiet land, marketed to families looking for peace. Neatly stacked terrace homes, humming ceiling fans, and the distant call to prayer at dawn. But beneath the shiny tiles and white plaster, the ground told a different story. Locals whispered about what came before. Stories of unmarked graves, abandoned cemeteries, and even tales of Japanese occupation during the war. But none of that had mattered. Not to the developers, not to the buyers, until the calls had began. It started as most hauntings do, with denial. A young couple, new to the neighborhood, complained to Telecom Malaysia. They said that their phones kept ringing in the middle of the night. But there was no one on the other end, just faint clicking, and then a woman's voice whispering their names, both of them. And when they pulled the cord from the wall, the phone kept ringing. Another house, 2 doors down, a teenage boy screamed so loud in the middle of the night that neighbors called police. He said he answered the phone and he heard his late grandfather's voice. The man called him by his old nickname, only one that the grandfather had ever used. And then more families had came forward. Some heard voices, some heard music from a different time. One man claimed his dead sister asked if the family still kept her room locked. Another woman said that her mother apologized for the abuse, even though the mother had been dead for 18 years. The phone calls were personal, and the callers knew things that they shouldn't have known. Telecom Malaysia ran diagnostics, no cross-wirings, and no faults. The police called it pranks, priests called it unrested souls, and residents weren't sure what to believe, until one household left for vacation and unplugged their phone before leaving. A neighbor house-sitting for them claimed the phone still rang, loud and constant. And when they finally answered it, the voice on the line asked, "Where are they?" The woman moved out a week later. And then there's one story, the kind that people only tell after looking over their shoulder first, about an elderly man who lived alone at the far end of the block. His wife had died that year before, and like clockwork, every night at 3:17 a.m., his landline would ring, and he always answered. Neighbors thought that it was grief, just routine. But one day, after weeks of this, the phone company came to remove his service. The line was disconnected, hardware taken. But that night, his phone rang anyway. The man didn't scream, he didn't cry. He just picked up the receiver and said, "I knew you'd find a way." And then he died in his sleep. Heart attack, the report said, but the phone was still on the hook, cradled in his hand. So, what was it? A prank, mass hysteria, crossed wires and imagination? Maybe. But those who lived in Taman Newtown in the 90s don't laugh when you ask. They get quiet. They look away. Some move out. Others just stopped answering their phones after dark. There were rumors that the neighborhood was built over a migrant graveyard, paved over without ceremony. Others claimed a local medium had tried to bless the land but left in a panic, saying, "Some of them don't want to leave. They still think that they live here." Even now, people claim that the land carries a kind of energy, that when the wind is quiet, you can hear phones ringing, even in houses that no longer have one. In the age where landlines are vanishing, the story of the Taman Newtown ghost phone is almost forgotten, just another urban legend gathering dust in the back of someone's memory. But for a short, strange window in the 1990s, phones rang across a quiet Malaysian suburb, and the people who answered heard things that no living person should have been able to say. If it was a haunting, it wasn't one of shadows or screams. It was a connection of messages from somewhere else, lingering in the wires long after the voices had gone silent. Maybe the dead didn't mean to scare anyone. Maybe they just missed home. In the fall of 2012, a man walked into a public library in Spokane, Washington, and asked for directions to a town called Wittenberg. He said that he had grown up there, had moved away sometime in the early 2000s, and hadn't been back in years. He remembered dirt roads, a diner with blue coffee cups, a faded mural on the brick wall downtown that said, "Together we grow." He wanted to see it again. But the librarian couldn't find Wittenberg in the system. Not in Google Maps, not in physical atlases, not even in the Jefferson County Records Archive. The man seemed confused, but not surprised. He had said, they must have taken it down again. And that is when the transmission begins. This is the story of the Wittenberg Signal, a missing town, a phantom frequency, and a memory that doesn't seem to belong anywhere, except the people who can forget it. The man gave his name as Colton Dreyer, age 43. He wasn't homeless, but he looked unrooted, like someone between lives. His backpack was filled with worn road maps, a solar battery bank, and 3 old Polaroids, one of a wooden water tower, one of a gravel parking lot with a church steeple in the distance, and one of him as a boy, standing in front of a sign that read, "Welcome to Wittenberg, population 361. He told the librarian that he'd been on the road for weeks, looking for any trace of the town. She asked what county it was in, and Colton had paused for a long time and said, "I think that it used to be in Jefferson, but it moved." When she gently explained that towns don't move, Colton pulled something out of his bag, a torn yearbook cover, worn and faded. It read, "Wittenberg High School, class of 1989. The librarian reported the encounter to local authorities not because Colton was threatening, but because she felt in her words, like he was telling the truth about something that couldn't be true. By the time that the sheriff's department arrived, Colton was gone. 2 weeks later, a ham radio operator named Tina Valdez, based in nearby Port Angeles, picked up an anomaly at 12.147 megahertz, a frequency mostly used for long-distance marine traffic. What she had heard had made no sense. A repeating voice broadcast, male, mechanical, and monotone. Wittenberg Station 1. Please confirm population report. Signal return not received. Wittenberg is waiting. The transmission lasted 90 seconds, repeated once every 5 minutes, and had a digital timestamp embedded in the background tone. 000000 W1N1. She posted the recording to a radio enthusiast forum, and within 48 hours, 3 more listeners from across the Pacific Northwest reported hearing the exact same loop, triangulated to somewhere deep inside the Olympic National Forest. It didn't match any licensed transmitter, emergency beacon, or NOAA station. The FCC claimed that it didn't exist. That is when a username, whitespace.tiff, an amateur satellite data analyst, uploaded something strange. They had pulled historical satellite overlays from 2001 through 2012, focusing on a 6-foot-mile stretch of dense forest in the western Olympic Peninsula. The earlier images showed nothing, dense canopy, no development. But starting in 2006, something faint appeared under the trees. A perfect grid of roots, unnaturally straight, evenly spaced, looping in a hexagonal pattern with no clear purpose. There were no labels, no paths in or out, and in the 2011 image, the grid was gone again, covered, removed, or glitched. And that was when people started asking, did a town used to be there? And if so, who erased it? In early November 2012, 4 friends from a survivalist forum, 2 ex-military, 1 forestry student, and 1 data engineer, entered the forest with a GPS pin based on signal triangulation. They hiked 14 miles off-trail over 2 days, and what they found was unnerving. Cracked pavement beneath moss, half-buried storm drains with no runoff, and a torn hand-painted street sign that read, Myrtle Loop. But there were no buildings, no mailboxes, no power poles, just the shadow of infrastructure. like the blueprint of a town with everything erased. And then they found something else. In the center of the clearing was a solar-powered transmitter, mounted to a steel pole, worn slightly humming, and the label on the side read, Wittenberg Station 1, property of WSDV-004. The transmitter was still active, weak, but pulsing on the same frequency. They had packed up early, said that the place gave them migraines. One of them claimed that they felt like they were being observed by something that didn't move. In January 2013, a podcaster named Evan Madley tracked down Colton Dreyer. He found him living within a storage unit near Bellington. Evan described the man as soft-spoken, lucid, and completely sincere, and clearly broken. Colton claimed that he had been born in Wittenberg, but the town had been evacuated in 2012 due to containment breach. When Evan asked what that meant, Colton had said, "It's hard to explain unless you lived there." They kept trying to fix the loop, but people started remembering things that they weren't supposed to. Colton showed him what he called a memory tag, a plastic wristband with a chipped serial number. When scanned by Evan's phone, it returned to a 404 error. The number had no owner. The format didn't match any state or federal ID schema. Days after the interview, Colton disappeared again. His storage unit was cleared. No forwarding address, and no digital trail. On February 17, 2013, a single final broadcast was recorded at 12.147 megahertz, captured by over a dozen operators across Oregon and Washington. This time, the voice was clearer, human, but flat, like someone reading from a teleprompter. The message lasted nearly 3 minutes. This is Wittenberg Station 1. The memory shell has expired. Loop integrity compromised. Units unresolved. Phase offset reached. And then a pause. And then eerily, the voice shifted in tone. If you remember Wittenberg, please return. Wittenberg is waiting. And it never aired again. Was Wittenberg real? A military test? A psychological experiment? A digital construct that broke containment? The FCC denies any knowledge of the frequency. Jefferson County has no records of the town. Satellite data from 2008 to 2012 has been scrubbed from public archives. No death records, no birth certificates, and no Colton Dreyer. But the yearbook, Wittenberg High, 1989, is still archived in one librarian's locked drawer, and she won't show it to anyone. She says that when she opens it now, the pages are blank. Imagine this. You were sitting at home with your family. No one is arguing. There's no sign of stress or fear. And then suddenly, without warning, someone in the house says, "We have to go. Now. Leave everything behind. Phones, wallets, IDs. We can't risk being tracked." And you listen. You obey. That is exactly what happened to the Tromp family, 5 ordinary people from Australia who in 2016 embarked on a chaotic and unexplained road trip that would spiral into a national mystery. The Tromps were a well-off, hard-working family from Sylvan, a quiet rural town outside Melbourne, Australia. The parents, Mark and Jacoba Tromp, both in their 50s, ran a successful berry farm. By all accounts, they were private, reliable, and close-knit. They had 3 adult children, Rena, Mitchell, and Ella. All lived and worked on the farm with their parents. No history of mental health, no brushes with the law, no drama, just a quiet, functional family. Until Monday, August 29th, 2016. That morning, the entire family of 5 got into Ella's silver Puiget SUV and just left. They fled the house without telling anyone. They left their phones, passports, and credit cards behind, as if trying to go off-grid. Their destination? Unknown. And their plan? A mystery. What's even stranger is that they were convinced that someone, or something, was after them. The exact threat was never clarified, but whatever it was, it terrified them enough to abandon their identities and vanish into the Australian countryside. At first, they all drove together, heading north towards Bathurst, New South Wales, over 500 miles away. But things began to fracture quickly. Just 30 kilometers in, the first anomaly occurred. Mitchell, the middle child, the only one who had brought his phone, was accused by his family of being tracked. Under pressure, he left the group, abandoning the escape plan entirely. Now down to 4, the rest of the family continued north. Somewhere along the way, Ella and Rena, the daughters, decided that the situation was spiraling out of control. They ditched the parents in New South Wales and drove to Goulburn, where they reported their family missing. But this is where the case turns from bizarre to absolutely surreal. The girls, now separated, started acting strange. Rena suddenly boarded a moving cargo truck and clung to the back until the driver stopped and called the police. She was described as catatonic and unresponsive when detained. She was later hospitalized under psychiatric observation. Ella, oddly calm, drove back to Melbourne, returned to the family home, and resumed life as if nothing had happened, despite the still missing parents and her sister in hospital. Meanwhile, Mark and Jacoba Tromp, now completely alone, were still on the run. With no phones, no money, and no clear plan, they ditched the car in Wangaratta, and what happened next borders on paranoia-driven hallucination. Witnesses saw Mark behave erratically, running away from people and even attempting to steal a vehicle. He eventually ran into the forest and vanished. At the same time, Jacoba was found wandering the streets, dazed and confused. She, like her daughter Rena, was taken in for mental health evaluation. And over the next few days, the Tromps began to resurface, but their explanations raised more questions than answers. Mitchell, who had separated early, told the police that he still wasn't sure what triggered the trip, just that his father became convinced that they were being watched, and his mother began to agree. Ella claimed that the family had been under immense stress, something that they had never showed to the outside world. Jacoba and Rena, once hospitalized, were released, both declining to speak publicly in detail. And Mark, the patriarch and final missing person, emerged from the forest 6 days later, tired and disoriented. No one was charged, no one was hurt, but the question still remained. What really happened? The leading theory is a shared psychotic disorder, specifically something called folie à deux, or madness of two, where a delusion is transmitted from one person to another. In this case, it may have been a folia familia, shared delusion among the whole family. Psychologists believe that Mark, under unknown stress or latent mental health, became convinced that the family was under threat, possibly from the government or data tracking technology. Jacoba, perhaps already anxious, had followed, and then the children, caught between trust and fear, joined in. But this is just a theory, because none of the Tromps have ever fully explained what they were afraid of. Even today, they maintain a wall of silence around the event. The Tromp family disappearance wasn't about money, crime, or cults. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It was a psychological fracture that burst into reality. For one strange week in 2016, pulling 5 people out of their lives and into a mystery that remains unsolved. Some stories drift quietly beneath the surface of public awareness, not loud enough to break into mainstream myth, but strange enough to linger in the minds of those who hear them. One such story comes from the 1970s in England, where 2 teenage girls began slipping into places that didn't belong in their world. No haunted houses, no dreams, but moments in time, replayed in front of their eyes like echoes no one could see. This is the unsettling, still unexplained story of the Aylmer twins. The Aylmer twins, Jerry and Gillian, lived a quiet life in the countryside of Kent, England. Identical in every way, the 2 girls were deeply close, even by twin standards. They shared not just a home, not just a wardrobe, but something else, something harder to define. A shared awareness of something off. It began with little things, changes in the weather that no one else noticed, animals acting strangely, a sudden, overwhelming feeling of disconnection, like the air around them had changed. And then one day, it happened. The twins had taken a walk near an old, familiar manor, one they had passed many times growing up. But on this day, something was different. The building looked new. The stone clean, the hedges trimmed. A gardener in old-fashioned clothes worked quietly in the yard. The girls were confused. Wasn't this the place that was supposed to be abandoned? They continued on, brushing it off as odd but not impossible. And by the next day, they passed the manor again. But this time, it was back to ruin, overgrown, cracked, and empty. They had asked their neighbors if any renovations had taken place, and no one had seen anything. The house, everyone insisted, had been in that state for years. And this was the moment that the twins realized that something extraordinary had happened. After that first experience, the slips started happening more often, sometimes together and sometimes alone. One day, Jerry walked into a clothing shop in town, or so she thought. The interior was completely different than usual. Dresses from the 1940s hung on the racks. The cash register was mechanical. The music playing was from another era entirely. She tried to speak to the shopkeeper, an old woman in vintage attire, but no one had responded. And then, without warning, she was back, surrounded by modern clothes. The shop had never changed, and the woman was gone. And no one around had noticed a thing. These weren't just hallucinations. The details were too precise, and the girls could describe places that no longer existed, right down to the wallpaper and scent in the air. Their knowledge was so specific, so exact, that when historians had checked, it matched perfectly with their archived photos and records. Places, people, and atmospheres from decades earlier, all accurately described by two young women who had no way of knowing such details. As news of the Aylmer twins spread into paranormal circles, researchers began to investigate. Psychologists suggested cryptomnesia, forgotten memories resurfaced as hallucination. Others proposed temporal lobe epilepsy, which can create feelings of déjà vu and vivid imagery, but neither girl showed signs of neurological issues. Some believed that it was a classic folie à deux, a shared delusion between twins so close that it created a reality only they could perceive. But skeptics had trouble explaining how they could reliably describe specific historical details with no prior exposure, even before archives were digitized. Others turned to more esoteric explanations. Time slips. The idea that under certain conditions, people can briefly fall through temporal cracks, experiencing fragments of the past that have somehow imprinted themselves on the landscape. Locations, in this theory, hold residual energy, like grooves in a record. Under the right emotional, magnetic, and psychological conditions, they play back, and a sensitive person might witness history replay itself. The Aylmer twins weren't the only ones reporting time slips in this part of England. Over the years, other locals described glimpses of horses where there should be cars, ghostly men in wartime uniforms, or houses appearing in one spot and then vanishing the next. Kent, it seemed, was quietly becoming a hotspot for this phenomena. One striking detail is that the Aylmer twins' experiences seemed to intensify in areas tied to strong emotional or historical events. Old battlefields, ruined estates, even locations affected by the Blitz during World War II. It was as if their presence somehow unlocked lingering loops in time, pieces of a reality that hadn't fully faded. And by the early 1980s, the Aylmer twins stopped giving interviews, and rumors had swirled that they were forced into silence by researchers, that one of them had vanished, that they had seen something too disturbing to speak of again. But the truth seems more grounded. They simply wanted privacy. Jerry and Jillian reported moving away from Kent, choosing a quiet life far from the public eye, and they've never retracted their claims. And when reached years later by a paranormal researcher, one of the sisters simply said, "We saw what we saw. Whether anyone believes it or not, it doesn't matter anymore." In the realm of strange phenomena, some cases stand out because they're loud, dramatic, or terrifying. But others, like the story of the Aylmer twins, leave a quieter impression. Not horror, not hysteria, just a subtle disturbance in what we think we know about time, memory, and reality. Were they truly slipping through the cracks of time, witnessing ghostly replays of the past, or tapping into something science has yet to understand? Maybe the past isn't really gone. Maybe, in some places, it's just waiting to be noticed. War is chaos. Soldiers fall, bodies are lost, and names fade from memory. But sometimes, Soldiers disappear in ways that defy even the logic of war. Not captured, not killed, just gone. And in 1915, during the brutal Gallipoli campaign of World War I, an entire British battalion, over 250 men, advanced into the battlefield and were never seen again. No survivors, no witnesses, and no bodies. This is the story of the missing battalion of Gallipoli. The Gallipoli campaign was one of the bloodiest and most ill-fated offenses of World War I. The Allied powers, including Britain, Australia, and New England, were attempting to seize control over the Dardanelles Strait from the Ottoman Empire, hoping to open a crucial supply route to Russia. But the terrain was brutal, the planning was poor, and the Ottoman resistance was far fiercer than expected. Among the thousands sent to the front was the 1/5th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment. Many of them were working-class men from rural England, farmers, bakers, and clerks, volunteers who had never fired a shot before the war. And on August 12, 1915, they were ordered to advance towards the village of Antiforta, deep in the Ottoman-held territory. They marched across open ground and vanished into legend. Eyewitnesses from the New Zealand Field Company, positioned nearby, claimed that they had saw something extraordinary that morning. According to a sworn statement given years later, a group of 6 or 7 strange, low-hanging clouds hovered above the battlefield. The largest of them, a dense, glowing mist, hung just above the ground, sitting in path over the advancing Norfolk men. The soldiers entered the cloud formation and never came out. The New Zealanders claimed that once the men had disappeared inside, the cloud lifted slowly into the sky and vanished, against the wind, merging with other clouds overhead. And they waited. Minutes passed, and then hours, but the battalion was gone. For weeks, no one could explain the disappearance. The initial belief was that the battalion had advanced too far and been cut down by Ottoman forces, or captured. But no mass grave was ever found. No prisoners were reported. The Turkish government denied capturing or even engaging with a unit of that size in the area. British officials listed the men as missing in action, and eventually presumed dead. But the mystery deepened further when the official war diary noted that the battalion had been last seen advancing into the mist near Hill 60, a reference consistent with the New Zealanders' bizarre account. The story might have faded into obscurity, just another casualty of war, if not for a remarkable document unearthed decades later. In 1965, 3 New Zealand veterans came forward with a joint affidavit, originally filed with the British Ministry of Defence. And in it, they described watching the battalion march into a strange, unnatural fog, one that behaved unlike anything that they had seen on a battlefield. One witness, Fred Reynolds, had stated, "It wasn't like smoke or gas. It didn't move with the wind. It just hovered, and then it took them." The affidavit, though controversial, gave new life to the theory that something other than warfare had occurred that day. So what really happened to the missing battalion? There are 4 main theories, each stranger than the last. The most controversial explanation is that the soldiers were killed by Ottoman forces, and their bodies went simply undiscovered, possibly buried in a shell crater or unmarked grave. But over a century of excavation and analysis, no evidence of such a mass grave has ever been found in the area. Some believe that the Ottomans did capture the battalion, but either executed them in secret or lost them to disease and chaos in POW camps, choosing to conceal the event for propaganda reasons. Again, no records support this, and the Ottomans were usually meticulous in documenting prisoners. The most controversial theory, fueled by the cloud witness reports, suggests a paranormal explanation, that the soldiers had entered a time slip or some kind of dimensional rift. The strange fog, the synchronized eyewitness accounts, the complete disappearance of over 250 men with no trace ever found. Some believe that they were transported elsewhere, perhaps even forward or backward in time, a theory often dismissed but never disproven. A fringe theory suggests that the battalion had been accidentally exposed to experimental weaponry, perhaps gas, hallucinogens, or even early forms of technology never declassified. The fog, in this theory, was real, but man-made. A mistake, a test gone wrong, one so horrific that authorities buried it under silence and time. Today, the official British records list the men of the 1/5th Norfolk Regiment as dead in battle. A memorial exists, names are engraved in stone. But for the families, and for the few who still research this case, the answer never came. And over a century later, we still don't know how an entire battalion walked into the mist and never returned. The Gallipoli campaign is remembered as a grim and costly failure, a chapter in the long tragedy of war. But hidden inside that story is a deeper mystery, one that defies explanation, rationality, and even history itself. An entire unit of men vanished without a trace, and all we're left with is a battlefield, a strange cloud, and a silence that has lasted more than 100 years. In the middle of the night, a woman in small-town Illinois awakens with a strange sensation. Her mouth feels numb, her limbs tingle, and she tries to call for help, but she can't move. And moments later, she smells something, sweet and sickly, like cheap perfume mixed with gasoline. And she is not the only one. Over the next 2 weeks, dozens of people across town reported the same thing: a mysterious figure spraying gas into their homes and leaving them paralyzed and terrified. No fingerprints, no suspect, and no motive. This is the story of the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. It started quietly. On the night of August 31st, 1944, a woman named Mrs. Kearney was at her home with her daughter in Mattoon, Illinois, a small, peaceful town about 150 miles south of Chicago. Around 11 o'clock p.m., she noticed a strange smell seeping through the bedroom window, and moments later, her legs went numb, her mouth and throat felt paralyzed, and she couldn't speak, couldn't move. In a panic, she had called for her sister next door, but by the time help arrived, the gas, and whoever might have released it, was gone. Her husband, a cab driver, returned home shortly after and had noticed a strange man near the window, fleeing into the night. Within days, the town was in chaos. More reports flooded in. People across Mattoon claimed that they were being attacked in their sleep, gassed by an unseen intruder. And victims described a sickly sweet smell before becoming dizzy or nauseous, temporary paralysis of the limbs, a strange metallic taste, and in many cases, they saw a shadowy figure running away. Some even reported seeing a person in dark clothes, sometimes wearing a mask, lurking near their windows. Newspapers dubbed the assailant the anesthetic prowler, but it wasn't long enough before a more theatrical name stuck: the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. As police scrambled to investigate, theories began to swirl. Some believed that the gasser was using a chemical agent, possibly chloroform, ether, or a war-era compound designed to immobilize victims. Keeping in mind that this was 1944, America was deep in World War II. The country was already on edge, fearing spies, sabotage, and chemical warfare. Could the Mad Gasser be an enemy agent, a local chemist gone rogue, or someone testing a new weapon? But the problem was, no physical evidence was ever found. No gas canisters, no footprints, no fingerprints. Nothing except for fear. And by mid-September, the case had reached its breaking point. Over 24 incidents had been reported. The local police chief, under pressure, finally issued a statement. He had blamed the entire thing on mass hysteria. According to him, the original attack may have been real, but every report after that, imagination, anxiety, and paranoia. He had suggested that the smell was caused by factory emissions, and the symptoms were psychosomatic, a trick of the mind fueled by fear and sensational media coverage. But many locals, including doctors, strongly disagreed. Victims described symptoms too consistent, too physical, to be dismissed as hallucination. Numbing, lasting for hours, pets falling ill at the same time, and children collapsing mid-breath. Could mass hysteria really cause entire families to go limp, their limbs paralyzed, while smelling the exact same scent? Or was someone out there, real, methodical, and silent, slipping through the darkness of Mattoon? Several eyewitnesses claimed to have seen a tall, thin man, dressed in black, fleeing the scene of a gassing. In one case, a witness reported that the man was carrying a device, possibly a flit gun, an old-fashioned sprayer used to dispense pesticides. This fueled the theory that the Mad Gasser was indeed a real person, using some kind of homebrew chemical cocktail to incapacitate people, maybe to rob them, or worse. But here's the thing. Nothing was ever stolen. No houses were ransacked, and no one was assaulted, and no messages were left. The gasser never spoke, never left clues, and never touched his victims. It was as if the attacks were purely for fear, as if the goal was panic itself. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. After September 13th, no more gassing incidents were reported. The mysterious figure, whether real or imagined, vanished completely, and the town slowly returned to normal. But the questions never went away. Who, or what, was the Mad Gasser of Mattoon? Was it a person, a psychological virus, a chemical attacker, or a fear that spread like smoke through a community already stretched thin by wartime anxiety? The case of the Mad Gasser remains unsolved to this day. No suspects were ever arrested, no gas ever identified. No explanation, scientific or otherwise, has ever been fully satisfied by both sides of the debate. Maybe it was mass hysteria. Maybe it was an experiment gone wrong. Or maybe, just maybe, someone really was out there, slipping through the shadows of small-town America, terrifying people not for profit or for pleasure, but for power. Fear itself is a weapon, and in 1944, someone in Mattoon had wielded it to perfection.
Join us for more stories next time on Beyond Belief, Fact or Fiction.